Go die in a shelter, old woman. My daughter-in-law's scream sliced through the September air as the bundle of my dresses, coats, and shoes came crashing down onto the dirty pavement. The words hit harder than the clothes striking the ground. I saw my neighbours freeze on their porches, children stop their games, and even the mailman hesitate mid-step, as if the whole block had been ordered to witness my humiliation. My son stood in the doorway of the apartment, the very apartment my hands and wages had paid for, and he said nothing, his silence more dangerous than her cruelty. I lowered myself slowly to the curb, not because my body was weak, but because rage makes the knees tremble in a way age never could. And while they threw my life into the street like trash, I carried a secret inside me. 2 days ago, I had already signed the eviction notice that would put them exactly where they had tried to put me. The air smelled faintly of fried chicken from a neighbour's kitchen and damp concrete after a light rain. My clothes, once folded with pride, now lay scattered like evidence of a life no one respected. A blouse I had sewn myself in the 80s, a leather purse I had bought with my first overtime paycheck at the nursing home, even the quilt my mother stitched by hand from scraps when we couldn't afford a blanket. All of it was tossed as if it had no value. My daughter-in-law's laughter carried down the block, sharp, deliberate, meant to cut me open in front of witnesses. She wanted the whole street to see that I had been thrown out like useless furniture. What she could not see was the paper tucked safely in my handbag, stamped with the seal of the county court, declaring her tenancy null and void. I sat with my belongings scattered around me, my hands resting on my knees, my breath steady, though my heart raced. My neighbours whispered. Some shook their heads in pity. Others pulled out phones to record, hungry for spectacle. One woman I had known for decades, Miss Lorraine, crossed the street and placed her warm hand on my shoulder. "They can't throw away your soul, baby," she whispered, her eyes steady on mine. Her words wrapped around me like armour, reminding me that I had endured worse storms. I had survived the days when banks slammed doors in my face because of the colour of my skin, when landlords spat the word no before I finished asking about rent, when red lines on maps told me where I could and could not live. I bought this apartment through struggle, through sacrifice, through joining with other black women in a savings circle where we pooled what little we had so one of us could buy property each year. Every brick in that building carried our history, and now my own son allowed his wife to spit on it. The humiliation burned, but beneath it pulsed something far stronger. My daughter-in-law thought she had written the final chapter of my life by shouting me into the street, but she had only written the prologue of her own downfall. Because while she was screaming, I had already been planning. I had already visited the legal aid office, where a young black attorney listened without interruption, as I explained how my son and his wife had drained my pension checks, maxed out my credit cards, and claimed my apartment as theirs, while telling me I was a burden. That attorney had given me the path, and I had walked it quietly, gathering documents, signing papers, preparing for the very day when their arrogance would meet the law. I lifted the quilt from the ground and pressed it to my chest. Its faded stitches carried the touch of my mother's hands, her sweat, her defiance, her belief that even scraps could be turned into warmth. Looking at it now, covered in grime from the sidewalk, I felt fury churn into resolve. My son avoided my gaze from the doorway, as though my eyes might remind him of the boy who once clung to me in fear of the dark. He had abandoned me not by leaving, but by standing still, by watching my humiliation unfold without raising a hand to stop it. Silence can kill more than words, and his silence tonight buried the last image I had of him as a child, worth saving. But I did not cry. Crying was for those who accepted defeat. Instead, I straightened my back as much as my age allowed and let the streetlights bathe my face in their pale glow. To the onlookers, I was an old black woman discarded by her family, another tragedy in a neighborhood too familiar with betrayal. But inside me lived a storm, patient and calculating. The same storm that had carried me through strikes at the nursing home, through marches when we demanded fair wages, through nights when I skipped meals so my children could eat. Endurance was my weapon, and tonight I wielded it like a blade. The laughter from upstairs sounded like victory to them, but I knew it was the laughter of the condemned, still celebrating at the gallows. They believed the eviction was mine, but the truth, signed, sealed, and already filed, was that it belonged to them. Soon enough, when the officers knocked on their door with papers in hand, the same neighbors watching me now would watch them. And when their furniture, their television, their carefully folded clothes lay sprawled on the very pavement where my quilt now rested, they would finally know the cost of cruelty. So I sat on the curb, calm in my stillness, letting them believe they had broken me. The secret inside me, the eviction notice carrying their names, warmed me more than any coat. They thought they had ended me with a shout, but I had already ended them with a signature. The night after my belongings were scattered across the street, I sat in the quiet of a borrowed armchair in Miss Lorraine's living room, my quilt draped across my knees, the air scented with the faint aroma of fried catfish and lemon that she had cooked for her grandchildren earlier that evening. Her house was small and full of the clutter of life well lived, with photographs lining the walls and the sound of an old gospel record playing softly in the background. And I realized I felt safer there than I had felt in my own apartment for months. It was not the safety of walls or locks, but the safety of being seen and not dismissed, of being held in the presence of someone who understood the dignity that still lived inside me, even as others tried to strip it away. Lorraine poured me a cup of tea, strong and bitter the way our mothers used to drink it after long days of work, and she told me quietly that she had already sent the video of my humiliation to the tenant association, because in her words, no one should think they can treat a woman like me that way without consequences. As I sipped the tea, I thought about the papers tucked inside my handbag upstairs in the spare bedroom, the eviction order signed by the judge that declared the apartment legally mine again. It had taken months to reach this point, months of walking into the county office with my folders of bills, bank statements, and mortgage records, months of sitting across from young attorneys who looked at me first with pity, but then with a sharper kind of respect once they realized I had kept every receipt, every document, every trace of proof that I had built and maintained that home long before my son and his wife ever set foot inside it. I had never been a woman of wealth, but I had been a woman of meticulous record-keeping, the kind who saved utility bills in shoeboxes and folded tax statements into labeled envelopes, because deep inside me I always feared that one day I would have to defend what little I owned. That day had come, and though the shame of being thrown into the street still stung, I knew the turning point had already passed when I pressed my pen to that court document. In the morning, I dressed carefully in my best church clothes, not because I was going to service, but because I wanted to step into the courthouse with my head high, carrying myself in the way my mother had taught me, chin lifted, shoulders back, eyes steady, even when the world tried to paint me small. The attorney who had taken my case, a young black woman named Denise, with eyes that glimmered both with fire and exhaustion from carrying too many clients at once, met me in the hallway. She clasped my hand and whispered that the order was already filed, the sheriff's office already notified, and that within a week officers would arrive to enforce the eviction. She told me it might get ugly, that my son and his wife would scream, protest, and accuse me of betrayal. But she reminded me that the law was on my side. For the first time in years, Hearing that phrase did not sound like empty words. It sounded like the echo of every step I had taken across decades of struggle just to have something to call my own. Leaving the courthouse, the air outside felt lighter than the day before, as if the weight of their insults had lifted just slightly off my shoulders. The city was noisy, cars honking, children rushing past with backpacks, preachers on the corners offering pamphlets. But all I could hear was the steady rhythm of my own heartbeat, reminding me that I was not finished. My humiliation on the street had been the spark, but this order was the flame, and I could feel it spreading into something larger than myself. Women I did not even know had started messaging Lorraine after she shared the video, some offering words of solidarity, others telling me that they too had been treated like burdens by the very children they had raised. And suddenly, my private pain was becoming public testimony. The thought frightened me and strengthened me at once, because it meant I was no longer fighting only for myself, but for all of us who had been told we were too old, too useless, too dependent to matter. That afternoon, I walked past my own building. Their voices carried through the open window, loud and carefree, as if the previous night's cruelty had cost them nothing, as if my absence was only a relief. My daughter-in-law's laughter, sharp as broken glass, cut through the air as she spoke on the phone to someone about new furniture she planned to buy, boasting about the space she had claimed as her own. My son said nothing that I could hear, only the low hum of a television playing in the background. For a moment, I stood there, clutching my handbag, the eviction order folded neatly inside, and I allowed myself to imagine the day when the sheriff would knock on that very door, when uniforms would step past their smug expressions and read aloud the words that declared their time up. I could almost see the shock on her face, the way her arrogance would collapse into rage and then fear. And though I am not a cruel woman, the vision warmed me with the comfort of justice long delayed. When I returned to Lorraine's house, I found her sitting at the kitchen table with another neighbour, a retired schoolteacher named Gloria, who had also seen what happened. They were deep in conversation, and as soon as I entered, they fell silent before Gloria looked me in the eye and said, "Baby, this is bigger than you think. What they did to you is what they try to do to all of us when we get older. They want our homes, our money, our silence. Don't let them make you small." Her words sank into me, not as comfort, but as fuel. For years, I had carried my burdens quietly, believing that endurance meant survival. But now I saw that endurance without resistance was only another form of surrender. That night, lying on Lorraine's couch with the quilt wrapped around me, I thought about the catalyst that had brought me here. It was not just the eviction papers or the shouting in the street, though both had cut me deeply. It was the moment when I realized that my silence would make me complicit in my own erasure. If I said nothing, if I allowed their cruelty to pass unchallenged, then I would become the burden they accused me of being. But if I stood, if I fought with the documents, the law, and the truth of my own history, then I would not only reclaim my home, but also reclaim my name. I would no longer be the old woman thrown onto the pavement. I would be the woman who turned humiliation into evidence, silence into testimony, and betrayal into justice. The catalyst was not one single event, but a chain of them, each linked by the steel of memory and the fire of survival. The night air filled with insults, the courthouse filled with paperwork, the neighbor's hand on my shoulder, the attorney's whispered reminder that the law was mine. Each moment formed the chain that pulled me from despair toward the fight ahead. I closed my eyes, listening to the creak of Lorraine's house settling into the night, and for the first time in many months, I let myself breathe without fear. The battle was only beginning, but the turning point had already passed. The papers were signed, the process underway, and all that remained was to face the storm when it came. The first real escalation came not from the courthouse or from the sheriff's office, but from the street itself, from the neighborhood that had always been both witness and judge to the lives of the people who lived within it. 2 nights after I had been thrown out with my belongings, my daughter-in-law decided to celebrate her apparent victory by dragging a large garbage bag full of my clothes and tossing it down the steps in broad daylight. Her voice raised so every passerby could hear her claim that she had finally rid herself of what she called dead weight. She shouted insults that clung to the air long after the bag hit the pavement, calling me useless, accusing me of draining their lives, declaring that I should have left long ago. The cruelty was deliberate, designed not just to wound me, but to brand me in the eyes of the community as someone who had no place, no worth, and no home. But cruelty, when performed so loudly, often becomes its own undoing. A neighbour named Sheila, who lived 2 doors down and who had always kept to herself, stepped outside with her phone already recording. She captured every word, every gesture, every cruel laugh as my clothes spilled out of the bag and onto the concrete. She recorded my son standing silently in the doorway, his arms crossed, his face a mask of indifference as his wife's voice rose higher and higher. And when Sheila later shared that video with the Tenants Association group chat, the story spread faster than my daughter-in-law could have imagined. By nightfall, nearly every household in the building and half the block had seen my humiliation on their screens, and the comments began pouring in, some in shock, others in anger, a few with bitterness, but most with a recognition that what they were witnessing was not just family conflict, but elder abuse playing out in public view. I found out about the video only after Gloria came knocking on Lorraine's door, phone in hand, her expression tight with outrage. She played it for me, and as I watched myself sitting on the curb while insults rained down on me, I felt both shame and a strange sense of vindication. To see my suffering through another's eyes was painful, but it also meant there was now proof, undeniable and unfiltered, that what I endured was real. The whispers I had feared, that people would believe I had simply lost my mind, that I was exaggerating, were now silenced by the clarity of the recording. There was my daughter-in-law's voice, shrill and cruel, declaring that I was nothing but a burden. There was my son, silent, complicit, betraying me with his refusal to intervene. And there I was, still, silent but not broken, clutching my quilt against the onslaught. The escalation grew the next morning when members of the association began calling an emergency meeting, insisting that behavior like this could not be tolerated in a building where families depended on one another for safety and dignity. What had begun as my private shame was becoming a public reckoning. My daughter-in-law, unaware of the storm gathering around her, continued her gloating, even telling neighbours in passing that she was finally free of the old woman who dragged them down. But every time she boasted, someone else shook their head or turned away, their sympathy shifting slowly but steadily toward me. In communities like ours, reputation carries weight, and the more she spoke, the more her own cruelty revealed itself. By the time I walked back to my building to collect a few more things with Lorraine by my side, I noticed the shift in the air. People no longer avoided my gaze. Some offered small nods of support. Others whispered quiet words as I passed. "Stay strong," one woman said softly. "You don't deserve this." For the first time in weeks, I felt the power of community leaning gently in my direction. Not enough to shield me completely, but enough to remind me that I was not invisible. When we reached the building, Sheila herself stepped forward and told me that she had already backed up the video, had already shared it with the attorney working my case, and that she would testify if it came to that. Her voice was firm, her resolve unshakable. And I realized in that moment that the cruelty of my own family had awakened a solidarity they had not anticipated. Inside the apartment, the atmosphere was thick with tension. My daughter-in-law's face flushed red when she saw me enter with Lorraine, her words dripping with sarcasm as she demanded to know what I was doing there. My son hovered in the background, his eyes darting nervously, as though he already knew that their grip on the apartment was beginning to slip. I said nothing at first, only bent to pick up the small stack of mail that still bore my name, the official letters and bills that served as reminders that this home had never truly belonged to them. When my daughter-in-law tried to snatch the mail from my hand, Lorraine stepped forward, her voice steady and sharp, reminding her that tampering with mail was a federal offense. The color drained from my daughter-in-law's face, but her arrogance remained. She hissed that no one would believe me, that I was just a bitter old woman clinging to a past that no longer mattered. Her words might have cut me days before, but now they only fueled the fire inside me. Because I knew, and she did not, that belief was no longer the issue. Evidence had replaced doubt. The video was spreading, the eviction order was filed, and the community's patience with her cruelty was thinning. Her shrill laughter sounded less like triumph and more like desperation, though she did not yet realize it. My son still avoided my eyes, and his silence was the heaviest weight in the room. But I recognized it now for what it was. Not indifference, but fear. He feared the collapse of the false stability they had built on my back, feared the moment when the sheriff would arrive, feared the shame of being exposed. And that fear, though unspoken, was my first taste of the power returning to me. The escalation did not stop at the apartment door. Over the next several days, word spread beyond the building. Friends from church began calling, some in shock, others offering prayer, a few confessing that they had been through something similar with their own children. Each conversation added another layer to my resolve. I realized that what was happening to me was not isolated. It was part of a wider pattern, one that too many women like me endured in silence. But silence was no longer an option. The evidence was out, the witnesses ready, and the law moving slowly but surely in my favor. One evening, as the sun dipped low and painted the brick walls of the building in shades of fire, I stood across the street and watched as my daughter-in-law threw open the window and shouted at someone on the phone about how she would redecorate the living room once the old woman's junk was gone. Her words carried into the street, and several neighbors turned their heads sharply, their faces hard with disapproval. I realized then that she was isolating herself, weaving her own noose with every cruel boast. Reputation in our community is a currency, and she was spending hers recklessly until none remained. The escalation was not yet the climax, but it was the turning point where the balance began to shift. No longer was I the silent victim thrown to the curb. I was the woman gathering evidence, building allies, watching as the very cruelty meant to erase me became the proof of my endurance. My humiliation had become their indictment, and with every passing day, their arrogance made my case stronger. The first escalation had begun, and I knew that what followed would only tighten the grip of justice around them. The midpoint of this battle arrived not with more insults, not with another video, but with the arrival of uniformed authority at the very threshold of the apartment that had been the stage of so much cruelty. On a warm Friday afternoon, the sheriff's deputies came, 2 men and 1 woman, their presence as steady and unshakable as the weight of the law they carried in their briefcases and in their clipped, professional voices. The building had grown unusually quiet that day because word had already spread, neighbors watching from behind curtains, children pulled back into doorways, the air charged with anticipation, as if everyone knew a storm was about to break inside the 4 walls of that apartment. I stood across the street, my heart hammering against my ribs, the folded eviction order in my bag, even though the deputies already carried their own copies, because something inside me needed to feel the paper under my hand, the tactile reminder that justice was no longer an abstract hope, but a living fact. When the deputies knocked, my daughter-in-law opened the door with her usual arrogance, her voice pitched high as she demanded to know what business they had. But arrogance does not intimidate uniforms, and when the deputy calmly read aloud the order signed by the judge, the words echoing down the stairwell and into the courtyard, her face twisted in confusion and rage. She shouted that it must be a mistake, that I had tricked them, that no court would dare put her out of the home she had decorated and claimed as her own. The deputy did not argue. He simply handed her the document, his finger pointing to the judge's signature and the date, his tone neutral but immovable, as he explained that they had 7 days to vacate voluntarily before forced removal would take place. Behind her, my son appeared, his shoulders slumped, his eyes refusing to meet mine where I stood beyond the gate. And in that moment, I saw not a man, but the boy he had once been, caught lying to his teacher and too ashamed to confess. The sound of those words, 7 days, rolled through the air like a church bell, each toll striking against the facade they had built. Neighbours stepped quietly closer, some pretending to sweep porches or walk their dogs, others openly watching, their eyes wide with the satisfaction of seeing justice made visible. For weeks, I had been the spectacle of humiliation, but now the stage belonged to them. My daughter-in-law's voice cracked as she insisted that she would call her cousin who worked for a lawyer, that she would have the order overturned, that none of this could possibly be real. But even as she shouted, the deputies remained steady, offering no judgment, only procedure, reminding her again that the time to argue had passed, that the court had spoken, and that the law now demanded compliance. The moment pierced through me with a strange mixture of triumph and sorrow. Triumph, because here was the undeniable shift, the turning point where the balance of power no longer tilted toward cruelty, but toward justice. Sorrow, because standing there watching my son shrink behind his wife's fury, I felt the ache of maternal love that refuses to die even in the face of betrayal. I remembered nights when I rocked him to sleep, mornings when I tied his shoelaces before sending him off to school, afternoons when I sat at kitchen tables explaining fractions with patience I could barely afford after long shifts at the nursing. Home, to see him now, silent and complicit, was to feel a grief deeper than the humiliation of the street, because it was the grief of recognizing that sometimes the children you raise do not grow into the men you prayed they would become. As the deputies left, the papers served and the order made clear, the block seemed to exhale. Doors opened, voices rose, and people whispered that they had never seen anything like it. A few even clapped softly, not loud enough to be heard inside the apartment, but loud enough to reach my ears. Their quiet applause was not only for me, but for the principle that had been defended, that no one, not even family, has the right to erase a woman's dignity and expect silence in return. I stood taller then, my spine straight despite the weight of years, my breath steadier than it had been in weeks, and I realized that this was the midpoint, the place in every struggle where the tide turns and where the outcome begins to reveal itself. That evening, I walked back to Lorraine's house with the image of my daughter-in-law's face etched in my mind, the way her eyes darted wildly as the deputy's voice cut through her bluster, the way her hands trembled as she clutched the paper, the way her body sagged when she realized the inevitability of what was coming. Lorraine cooked beans and cornbread, the kind of meal that fills the stomach and anchors the soul. and we ate together while she told me that the neighborhood was buzzing, that everyone was already retelling the scene with their own flavor, but that the essence remained the same. The old woman who had been thrown to the street was now the one standing firm, while the ones who mocked her were the ones counting down their days. The midpoint was not only about legal papers or community whispers, it was about the shift inside me, the recognition that I had crossed from endurance to action, from silence to testimony, from shame to strength. For so long, I had believed that to survive was enough, that to keep my head down and my dignity intact in private was the best I could hope for. But the public nature of my humiliation had demanded a public response. And now, the public nature of my vindication was demanding something even greater. That I accept the role of a woman who does not only endure, but who exposes, who fights, who claims the justice she is owed. As I lay in bed that night, the quilt pulled up to my chin. I thought about the generations of women who had come before me, women who had been told to swallow their pain, to hide their bruises, to accept the betrayal of those they loved because family came before everything. I thought of my own mother, who stayed silent when her husband spent his paycheck in bars, who stitched quilts from scraps to keep us warm because asking for more would have meant more violence. I thought of the women I had cared for in the nursing home, women who whispered confessions in the dark about children who abandoned them, about pensions stolen, about dignity stripped in silence. And I realized that my fight was not only mine, but theirs too, a continuation of the same story written in different times and different rooms, but always with the same ink of struggle. The midpoint of my story was this. I was no longer the victim waiting for rescue. I was the woman carrying the signed order, the woman whose neighbors had become witnesses, the woman whose humiliation had transformed into evidence, the woman who stood on the cusp of reclaiming not only her home, but her narrative. The escalation had begun with videos and whispers, but here, in the steady voice of the deputy reading aloud the judge's words, the shift was undeniable. 7 days. That number echoed in my mind like scripture. Each day a drumbeat carrying me closer to the climax that would expose them fully and restore me completely. I closed my eyes and let the rhythm carry me into sleep, knowing that the worst had not yet come, but that the turning point had already arrived. And once a tide turns, no arrogance, no silence, no cruelty can push it back. The midpoint was not the end, but it was the beginning of their end, and the beginning of my rebirth. The days following the deputy's visit should have been filled with relief, but instead they twisted into something darker, something that reminded me that justice, even when stamped with a judge's signature, is never straightforward. My daughter-in-law, furious at the thought of losing the walls she had claimed as her palace, stormed into the management office of the building and declared that I had forged the documents, that I had manipulated the system, that an old woman, desperate for relevance, had pulled strings she could never understand. She spun stories about me being confused, about me suffering from the kind of age-related decline that made me unfit to manage property or finances, and she backed her accusations with a carefully rehearsed sweetness that dripped like poison, disguised as honey. I learned of this betrayal when the building manager called me to his office, his face lined with discomfort, his words hesitant as he explained that he had been pressured to reconsider my claims of ownership. He showed me a letter they had presented, signed by a lawyer whose name I did not recognize, claiming that I was mentally unfit, that I had been manipulated into signing things I did not understand. To read those words about myself was like swallowing shards of glass. For all my years of work, for all the meticulous records I had kept, for all the clarity of mind I had demonstrated, they wanted to brand me as senile, as incapable. as a woman whose very voice could not be trusted. It was an erasure more violent than being thrown onto the street, because it was not about my body, but about my mind, about my very right to speak for myself. I walked home from that meeting with my chest burning and my legs trembling, the city spinning around me in waves of noise and indifference. Lorraine sat me down at her kitchen table when I told her, her hands wrapping tightly around mine, her eyes sharp with fury as she said that they were trying to break me where the law had already failed them. She reminded me that women like us had always been painted as unstable when we refused to be silent, that history itself was filled with attempts to strip us of credibility whenever we raised our voices. Her words steadied me, but the pain did not vanish. It stayed lodged inside me like a splinter that refused to come out, each throb reminding me that the battle was not yet won. The injustice of it all struck deeper than the insults on the street. To be accused of losing my mind when my entire survival had depended on its sharpness felt like an attempt to erase not only the present, but the decades behind me. I thought of the nights when I balanced bills at the kitchen table, stretching dollars until they could not stretch any further. Of the mornings when I managed medications for dozens of residents at the nursing home without error. Of the years when I held an entire family together with nothing more than willpower and organization. And now, those years were being rewritten into weakness by people who wanted only to protect their comfort. My attorney, Denise, reassured me that their claims held no real legal weight, that the documents I had signed were valid, that the evidence was airtight. But she also warned me that these accusations could slow the process, could add hearings, could drain my energy with delays and paperwork. I felt the unfairness of it settling heavily on my shoulders, because time itself is a weapon when you are 68 years old, when every delay is another week of humiliation, another night spent outside of your own home, another opportunity for the guilty to smear your name. They wanted me exhausted, worn down, willing to give up the fight simply to find peace, and the cruelty of that strategy cut as deep as any insult. The injustice spread beyond the legal papers. I began to notice whispers when I walked down the block, not from those who had seen the videos and supported me, but from those who half believed the rumors. "Maybe she's confused," one woman murmured, her voice carrying across the stoop. "Maybe she doesn't remember things the way she used to." The sting of those words was sharper than the cold air. Reputation, once fractured, takes longer to heal than any broken bone. And I realized that my daughter-in-law knew this. She had grown up in a world where perception was power, and she was wielding it ruthlessly, determined to make me look weak, even as the law stood behind me. I spent long nights staring at the ceiling of Lorraine's guest room, listening to the ticking of her clock, replaying the accusations in my mind until they felt almost real. Was I slipping? Had I forgotten something important? The doubt crept in like a shadow, because that is what injustice does. It makes you question yourself even when you know the truth. But each morning, I reminded myself that I still remembered every detail of my fight, every figure in my bank statements, every conversation with the court, every name of the residents I had cared for years ago. My memory was not failing. My mind was not weak. The only weakness belonged to those who could not stand on the truth and so tried to rewrite reality to protect their lies. The unjust turn did not erase the progress I had made, but it poisoned it with bitterness, slowing each step, filling each day with tension. It taught me that victory would not come cleanly, that even when the law was on my side, those who wanted to destroy me would claw and scrape at every corner of possibility to drag me down. It was a reminder that injustice is never just about one act. It is a strategy, a campaign, a constant attempt to suffocate hope. But I refused to let it succeed. I looked at myself in the bathroom mirror each morning, tracing the lines on my face, the scars of a life lived. And I told my reflection that I was still here, still standing, still remembering, still fighting. They could not erase me, not with papers, not with whispers, not with lies. This unjust turn, as painful as it was, became another layer of resolve. If they wanted to call me confused, I would answer with clarity. If they wanted to slow me down, I would outlast them with patience. If they wanted to smear my name, I would rebuild it louder, stronger, unbroken. Because I knew then what I had not known before, that injustice is not the end of the story. It is the twist that demands the next act, the force that transforms pain into power, the shadow that makes the fire burn brighter. And though they thought they had trapped me in that shadow, I was already searching for the light that would lead me through. The days that followed were thick with tension, as if the entire neighborhood had inhaled and refused to exhale, waiting for the final blow to fall. My daughter-in-law's accusations of my supposed confusion and incompetence had left their mark, not because they carried truth, but because they introduced hesitation into the eyes of some who looked at me. I could feel it in the way certain neighbors greeted me now with overly sweet voices, pitying rather than supportive, and in the way others avoided eye contact altogether, unwilling to choose sides openly. It was as if I had been placed on trial in the court of public opinion, while the legal battle crept forward at its slow, grinding pace. But even as doubt tried to circle me, I refused to let it consume me, because I knew the time for hesitation had passed. The escalation was coming, and I had to be ready. I had already gathered evidence for months: bank statements, mortgage records, receipts from every bill I had paid since the day I first stepped into that apartment. I had folders stacked with proof of ownership, proof of payments, proof of the very life I had built inside those walls. But now, faced with a campaign to paint me as unfit, I realized that documents alone would not be enough. I needed witnesses. I needed the living testimony of those who had seen with their own eyes what had been done to me. And slowly, the witnesses began to emerge. Sheila, who had filmed the first video, agreed to swear under oath that she had seen me thrown out with my belongings. Gloria, who had taught in the local school for decades, offered to testify that my memory and clarity of mind were as sharp as ever. Even the mailman, who had delivered envelopes to me for 20 years, told me he would be willing to explain that I had always signed for registered packages without hesitation, never once showing signs of confusion. Piece by piece, I was building not just a legal defense, but a wall of truth so strong that no smear campaign could topple it. The escalation sharpened when another video surfaced, one I had not known existed. A young man from down the block, barely out of high school, had recorded my daughter-in-law one afternoon as she screamed into her phone in the courtyard, boasting that she would drive the old woman crazy before the court even finished with her. Her words, captured in full, left no room for interpretation. It was cruelty laid bare, a confession of strategy, a glimpse into the mind of someone who believed manipulation was victory. When that video landed in the inbox of my attorney, Denise, she called me immediately, her voice trembling with the kind of excitement that only comes when justice is handed evidence too sharp to ignore. With that video, the smear campaign against me no longer looked like concern for my well-being. It looked exactly as it was: calculated abuse. Still, the days grew heavier. My son avoided me completely, never daring to cross the street where I stayed with Lorraine, never daring to call, as if ignoring me would erase the truth. Yet in his silence, I saw the shadow of guilt, because silence in the face of lies is never neutral. It is complicity. I thought often of the boy he had been, of the way he once begged me to help him with his first apartment application, of the nights he called me for money when emergencies struck, of the countless sacrifices I had made to keep him afloat. To be erased from his life now, not by death, but by betrayal, was a wound deeper than any other. But I refused to let that wound become weakness. Instead, I carried it like a scar, proof of what I had endured and of what I would overcome. The second escalation arrived in full force when Denise filed a counter-motion against the claims of my incompetence, attaching not only my folders of evidence, but also the testimonies and the new video. She explained to me that by attacking their lies directly, we could shift the case from one of simple eviction enforcement into one of documented elder abuse, a charge far more serious than my daughter-in-law had ever anticipated. The law, once slow and distant, began to move with sharper edges. Meetings were scheduled, hearings arranged, and suddenly the apartment that had been a fortress for them was under siege from every angle. My daughter-in-law's arrogance cracked in public view. She yelled at neighbors who refused to take her side, slammed doors in frustration when people questioned her behavior, and lashed out at anyone who dared mention the videos. The more she fought, the more isolated she became. Even those who had once believed her whispers of my confusion now looked at her with suspicion, because cruelty cannot hide behind charm forever. My son remained silent, his face pale, his body thin from restless nights. And I began to wonder if he realized that the life they had built on lies and greed was beginning to crumble beneath their feet. The escalation also lived inside me. I felt it in the way my chest no longer tightened with fear when I walked past the apartment, in the way my voice grew firmer each time I spoke with Denise, in the way I looked into the mirror and saw not a victim, but a fighter. I carried the quilt my mother had stitched like a shield, its fraying edges a reminder that even scraps could be turned into strength. Each time I held it, I remembered that survival is not silence, that endurance is not enough unless it leads to action. I had endured, I had been humiliated, but now I was striking back with the only weapons I needed: truth, evidence, and the voices of those who refused to be silent witnesses. The night before the scheduled hearing, I sat in Lorraine's kitchen with a circle of women who had gathered to support me. They brought sweet potato pie, cornbread, fried chicken, dishes that filled the room with warmth and reminded me of Sundays after church when the community gathered not just to eat, but to affirm one another's existence. As we ate, they told me stories of their own struggles: pensions stolen by sons, savings drained by daughters, homes lost to greedy relatives. Each story was a thread, and together they wove a tapestry of resilience, proof that I was not alone, proof that the fight was not mine alone, but part of something larger. We prayed together that night, not for vengeance, but for justice, not for punishment, but for freedom, not for humiliation, but for dignity. When I closed my eyes to sleep, I could feel the escalation pulsing through every part of my being. The battle was no longer about a single apartment, no longer about a single betrayal. It was about reclaiming my voice, about exposing the cruelty of those who thought silence was inevitable, about standing tall not only for myself, but for every woman who had been told she was too old, too weak, too confused to matter. The escalation was not the end, but it was the surge before the climax, the gathering of force before the final strike. And as I lay beneath my quilt, listening to the night hum with the quiet solidarity of those who believed in me, I knew that the tide had shifted completely. What had begun as humiliation was now becoming a reckoning, and no lie, no smear, no act of cruelty could stop what was coming next. The morning of the hearing dawned heavy with rain, the kind that seems to wash the city clean, yet also exposes every crack in the pavement, every weakness in the foundation of buildings too long neglected. I rose before the sun, unable to sleep with the weight of what was about to unfold pressing against my chest. The quilt my mother had stitched so many decades ago rested across my knees as I sat at Lorraine's kitchen table, sipping bitter coffee and watching the droplets slide down the window pane. Each bead of rain felt like a countdown, each clap of thunder like the drumbeat of inevitability. Today was the day when silence would no longer protect my son or his wife, when the lies they had woven so carefully would unravel in the bright light of a courtroom where evidence, not arrogance, would be heard. By the time we arrived at the courthouse, the rain had softened to a mist, but the air was still thick with tension. Denise walked beside me, her briefcase clutched firmly in her hand, her stride steady, her expression calm but fierce. She had prepared me for every possible turn, every attempt the opposing lawyer might make to twist the narrative, every insult that might be hurled to paint me as senile or confused. Yet no amount of preparation could fully brace me for the sight of my son standing on the other side of the hallway, his head bowed, his wife clinging to his arm with the desperate grip of someone who knows her world is collapsing. He glanced at me once, his eyes flickering with something that looked like shame. But he quickly looked away when his wife whispered furiously into his ear. The distance between us felt like miles, though in truth it was only a few steps. And in that distance lay years of betrayal, silence, and lost love. Inside the courtroom, the atmosphere was electric. Neighbours filled the benches, some called as witnesses, others arriving simply to see justice carried out. Sheila sat in the front row, her phone in hand, ready to provide the original video files if needed. Gloria adjusted her glasses, her notebook full of dates and observations resting on her lap like sacred scripture. Even the mailman had come, his uniform crisp, his eyes steady, his voice prepared to say what he knew to be true. The presence of so many familiar faces steadied my heartbeat, reminding me that I was not alone, that my story was no longer mine alone, but carried by a community that refused to let lies triumph. The proceedings began with formality, the judge's voice clear and commanding, the shuffle of papers echoing in the high-ceilinged room. Denise spoke first, her words deliberate and unwavering as she laid out the facts. The apartment legally mine, the payments made by my hand, the records kept meticulously for decades. She played the videos one after the other, the courtroom silent except for the crackling audio of my daughter-in-law's shrill insults, the laughter of my son's silence, and finally the damning clip where she boasted about driving me crazy before the court even finished with her. Each word fell into the room like a stone into still water, ripples of shock spreading across the faces of those listening. When the opposing lawyer rose to speak, his tone was smooth, rehearsed, but already strained under the weight of evidence. He tried to paint me as confused, as a woman too old to understand the documents she had signed, as someone manipulated by lawyers into fighting a battle she could not possibly comprehend. His words might have landed weeks earlier, when whispers of my mental decline still held sway, but now they sounded hollow. Denise countered each point with precision, calling witnesses who spoke with clarity and conviction. Sheila described what she had seen, her voice trembling only slightly as she recounted how my belongings had been thrown onto the street. Gloria spoke of my sharp memory, of the conversations we had about history and politics that no confused woman could sustain. The mailman testified that I had never once faltered in signing for deliveries, never once given reason to doubt my competence. With each testimony, the foundation of their accusations cracked further, until it was clear that the smear campaign had collapsed under the weight of truth. Then the judge turned to me, asking if I wished to speak. My throat tightened, my hands trembled, but I rose from my seat, quilt draped across my shoulders like armor, and I let the silence stretch for a moment before I spoke. I told the court of the decades I had worked, the sacrifices I had made, the nights without sleep, to pay for the very roof they had tried to strip from me. I described the humiliation of sitting on the curb while my life was thrown into the street, the sting of being told to die in a shelter by the woman who had lived off my generosity. My voice cracked when I spoke of my son, not to curse him, but to grieve him, to mourn the boy I had raised, who now stood as a stranger before me. And then I ended with the truth that had carried me through every sleepless night: that dignity is not a gift to be granted by others, but a birthright, and no amount of cruelty, no campaign of lies, no betrayal by blood could take it from me. The courtroom was silent when I finished, the kind of silence that feels alive, heavy, charged with the weight of recognition. The judge nodded once, her eyes steady, and then she spoke the words that brought the culmination of my struggle into the open. The eviction order upheld, the accusations against me dismissed as unfounded, the apartment legally and unquestionably mine. My daughter-in-law gasped, her face twisting with rage, her body shaking as she clutched at my son's arm, demanding he protest, demanding he speak. But he said nothing, his silence finally cracking into defeat as he lowered his head and allowed the moment to pass. The gavel struck once, sharp and final, and with that sound, the years of silence, humiliation, and doubt dissolved into a victory I had fought for with every breath. When we stepped out of the courthouse, the rain had stopped, the sky clearing into a pale stretch of blue. Neighbours surrounded me, their voices warm, their hands reaching to squeeze mine, their words weaving around me like a blanket of affirmation. Cameras from local reporters flashed, capturing my quilt, my steady gaze, my refusal to be erased. I did not seek fame, but I knew then that my story would travel beyond the block, beyond the city, becoming a testimony for others who had been silenced, a reminder that even in old age, even after betrayal, even after public humiliation, justice could still be claimed. The climax was not just the legal victory, not just the upholding of the eviction order. It was the public stripping away of lies, the collapse of the smear campaign, the undeniable truth spoken aloud in a room where everyone was forced to listen. It was the moment when I reclaimed not only my home but my name, my dignity, my story. And as I stood in the courthouse steps, quilt still draped across my shoulders, I felt the strength of generations flowing through me, carrying me forward into a future no longer defined by betrayal, but by survival, by truth, by justice finally made visible. The days after the court's decision unfolded slowly, like the air after a violent storm when the clouds finally break and the world is left raw, drenched, but undeniably cleaner. Returning to the apartment was not simply unlocking a door. It was stepping back into the space that had once been twisted against me and reclaiming it as my own. The deputies had enforced the eviction swiftly, their presence firm and unyielding as they carried out the order. My son and his wife stood on the pavement below, their possessions piled high in boxes and bags, their voices raised in protest. But the crowd that gathered did not rally to their defense. Neighbors who had once looked away now watched openly, their eyes hard, their expressions sharp with memory. They had witnessed the cruelty, they had seen the videos, they had heard the evidence, and now they saw the consequence. The same street where my quilt and clothing had been scattered weeks earlier now bore the sight of their furniture and belongings exposed in the harsh light of day. What they had done to me had circled back to them, and though I did not rejoice in their pain, I could not deny the justice in its symmetry. Inside, the apartment felt different. The air smelled stale, the walls marked with their neglect, the floors covered with the dust of arrogance and entitlement. Yet as I walked from room to room, my footsteps slow but steady, I could feel the place beginning to breathe with me again. The living room, once filled with their laughter that excluded me, now held only silence. And that silence was mine. The kitchen, where I had once been scolded for being too slow, now waited for me to cook again. Not for ungrateful mouths, but for myself, for the neighbours who had stood by me, for the community that had carried me through. In the bedroom, the light filtered gently through curtains I had chosen years ago, and I stood for a long while, simply letting the sunlight rest on my face, knowing that I had earned this peace not through luck, but through persistence, through endurance, through the refusal to be erased. That first evening back, I invited Lorraine and Gloria to join me for supper. We ate simply, beans, rice, cornbread, but the taste of that meal felt richer than anything I had eaten in years because it was flavoured with freedom. We sat at the kitchen table, laughing quietly, remembering the tense nights of doubt, recalling the courtroom's silence as truth broke open, reflecting on the weight of what had been survived. Lorraine brought peach cobbler, still warm from her oven, and as we shared it, I realized that reclaiming my home was not just about bricks and walls, but about filling the space again with voices that respected me, with love that nourished instead of drained, with presence that affirmed rather than diminished. In the days that followed, neighbours came by in twos and threes, some bringing small gifts, others simply offering words. Sheila brought a potted plant, saying it would look good by the window. The mailman left a note on my doormat, written in his neat script. "Proud of you. Glad justice was done." Even people I had not known well before stopped me in the hallway to tell me they had watched, that they had learned from my fight, that they saw themselves in my struggle. I began to understand that my story had become more than a personal battle. It had become a mirror for many who had endured quietly, who had felt the sting of betrayal, who had doubted their own strength in the face of cruelty. By standing, by fighting, by refusing to be silenced, I had given them a glimpse of what could be possible. And yet, beneath the warmth of victory, there remained the ache of loss. My son did not return, not with apologies, not with explanations, not even with anger. His silence stretched across the days like a shadow, a reminder that justice does not heal every wound, that truth does not always restore broken bonds. At night, as I folded my quilt at the foot of the bed, I sometimes allowed myself to remember him as a boy, his small hand tucked into mine, his voice calling for me when nightmares woke him. I grieved that boy, because the man he had become seemed beyond my reach. But grief did not erase victory, and love, though wounded, did not erase dignity. I learned to carry both, the ache of what was lost and the strength of what was reclaimed, without letting one diminish the other. The apartment grew warmer each day, not only with my presence, but with the presence of those who came to share it. Children stopped by after school to help carry groceries. Church friends visited, bringing hymns sung softly in the living room. The tenant association asked me to speak at their next meeting to tell my story as a warning and a lesson. Standing before them, I spoke not with bitterness, but with clarity, reminding them that silence is what cruelty counts on, that records and evidence are weapons when wielded with patience, that community is the shield no individual can build alone. I watched their faces as they listened, and I knew my words had landed, that my pain had been turned into a kind of map for others. As the weeks passed, the sting of humiliation began to fade, replaced by something steadier, something calmer. I planted herbs on the windowsill, their green shoots stretching toward the sun. I rearranged the furniture, placing the table near the window where light could fall across it in the mornings. I hung new curtains, pale and simple, a gesture of renewal. And each evening, as the city settled into its rhythms, I sat by that window with a cup of tea, listening to the hum of life outside, feeling no fear of the footsteps in the hall, no dread of voices raised against me, no weight of lies pressing down. What remained was silence, but it was no longer the silence of suppression. It was the silence of peace. The resolution of my story was not triumph painted in fireworks or applause, but the quiet strength of knowing that I had faced betrayal, cruelty, and erasure. And I had not only survived, but prevailed. The street where my belongings once lay now knew me not as the woman discarded, but as the woman who stood, who fought, who reclaimed. The community that had once whispered now spoke my name with respect. The apartment that had once been a battleground was again a sanctuary, and I, an old black woman with scars of years and memories stitched into a quilt, had proven that dignity, once seized, can be reclaimed, that truth, once buried, can rise, and that even when family betrays, justice can still be found. Each night, as I turned off the lamp and slid beneath the quilt, I whispered a prayer, not for vengeance, not for what had been lost, but for gratitude, for the strength to endure, for the clarity to fight, for the grace to accept both victory and sorrow in the same breath, because life, I knew now more than ever, was not about being spared from storms, but about standing when they pass, about looking at the wreckage and choosing to rebuild, about finding peace not in the absence of struggle, but in the triumph of surviving it with dignity intact. And as I drifted into sleep, the hum of the city around me, the quilt warm against my skin, I knew I had done exactly that.